Sometimes the hardest choice a man faces is between his own peace and someone else's pain. Sometimes doing what's right means losing everything you've worked to build. In the Montana mountains, Ezekiel Thorne had spent 15 years living alone, away from people and their troubles. He liked his quiet life among the pine trees. Then one evening, a young woman in a torn wedding dress ran into his camp crying. She begged him to follow her home to town. Zeke didn't want to get involved, but something in her eyes made him say yes. When they reached Mercy Hill, he saw something that broke his heart. The whole town had watched this girl get forced into marriage with a cruel man who wanted her land. Now Zeke had to decide if he would walk away or fight for what was right. But what happens when helping someone means facing the past you've been hiding from for 15 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air bit sharp against Ezekiel Thorne's weathered face as he stepped from his cabin into the pre-dawn darkness. At 43, he moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned to waste nothing, not motion, not words, not trust. His massive frame, built like the pines that surrounded his sanctuary, cast a long shadow in the moonlight filtering through the canopy above. 15 years. 15 years since he'd last spoken more than a handful of words to another human being. 15 years since he'd traded the company of men for the honesty of wolves and the reliability of seasons that changed without betrayal or bloodshed. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing. He'd carved from the wilderness with his own hands, using nothing but an axe and the kind of stubborn determination that had once made him valuable to the Union Army. The structure stood solid and square, built to last through Montana winters that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Chinked logs sealed tight against the wind, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning light. It was a home that spoke of solitude chosen, not imposed. Zeke moved through his morning ritual with practiced precision. Coffee first, black and strong enough to wake the dead, brewed in a battered tin pot that had followed him from Tennessee to Colorado to this remote corner of the Montana Territory. While it heated, he checked his traps, noting the fresh deer sign near the creek and the way the wind carried the scent of early snow from the high peaks. His hunting knife hung at his belt, its leather-wrapped handle worn smooth by years of use. The blade itself bore the scratches and nicks of countless tasks, skinning game, cutting rope, and once, long ago, other purposes he preferred not to remember. It was a tool that had served him well in war and peace, though he'd found peace made fewer demands on a man's soul. The memories came anyway, as they always did in the quiet moments. Faces of boys he'd led into battle, their eyes bright with trust and terrible purpose. The weight of command, the burden of decisions that meant life or death for men who followed him because they believed he knew the way home. He'd known the way to victory, certainly, but home had proven more elusive. That's why he'd come here, to this place, where the nearest neighbor was a day's hard ride away, and the only decisions that mattered were whether to hunt or fish, whether to repair the roof before the next storm or wait another week. Simple choices with consequences that fell only on his own shoulders. He was splitting. Wood for the evening fire when she appeared. The sound reached him first, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal, all desperate haste and careless noise. Zeke's hand moved instinctively to his knife handle, his body tensing with reflexes that 15 years of peace hadn't quite managed to dull. But when the figure stumbled into his clearing, gasping and sobbing, he found himself staring at something that made no sense in his ordered world. A young woman, barely out of girlhood, wearing what had once been a wedding dress. The white silk hung in tatters around her ankles, stained with mud and torn by branches. Her dark hair had escaped whatever pins had once held it in place, hanging wild around a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep terror that spoke of horrors witnessed and endured. She saw him standing there, axe in hand, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the clearing. Her eyes, wide and brown as autumn chestnuts, took in his size, his isolation, the careful distance he kept from the world. Whatever she saw there must have decided her, because she took 3 stumbling steps forward and fell to her knees in the pine needles. "Please," she gasped, her voice cracked from running and crying. "Please, you have to help me. You have to come back with me." Zeke set down his axe slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. A runaway bride was trouble of the worst kind, the kind that followed a man home and demanded explanations he didn't have to give. His first instinct was to point her toward the main trail and wish her luck finding help somewhere else. But something in her face stopped him. It wasn't just fear he saw there, or even desperation. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything and was making one last gamble with the only chips she had left. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, his voice rusty from disuse. "Temperance," she whispered. "Temperance Vale. My father was William Vale. He had a spread down near Mercy Hill until he passed last month." The name meant nothing to him, but the grief in her voice was real enough. "What happened to you, Miss Vale? Where'd you run from in that dress?" The question seemed to break something inside her. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she struggled to find words for whatever had driven her into the wilderness in wedding clothes. "They made me marry him," she said finally. "Silas Blackwood. He said it was legal, said he had papers that gave him the right to Papa's land if I didn't take his hand in marriage. The whole town just stood there and watched while he—" Her voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces together. Zeke felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen enough of the world to know how these stories usually ended, and none of those endings were good for girls like the one kneeling in his clearing. "Miss Vale," he said carefully, "if you're looking for the law, you'd best head east toward Helena. They've got a territorial marshal there who might—" "No!" The word came out sharp and desperate. "You don't understand. He owns the sheriff. He owns the mayor. He owns half the territory through debt and fear and worse things." She looked up at him with those autumn eyes, and he saw something there that reminded him of soldiers before a desperate charge. That moment when a man realizes he's probably going to die, but decides to face it standing up anyway. "Please," she said again. "I know you don't know me. I know you probably want me gone from your place, but I've got nowhere else to turn. Papa always said there was a mountain man up here who'd once been a soldier, a good man who chose quiet over noise. He said if trouble ever came that the law couldn't handle, maybe that mountain man would remember what it felt like to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. Protect people who couldn't protect themselves. How many years had it been since anyone had asked him to be that man again? How many years since he'd wanted to be? He looked at her kneeling there in the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of her life, and felt something shift inside him like ice breaking up on a frozen river. The careful isolation he'd built around himself suddenly felt less like safety and more like cowardice. "Get up, Miss Vale," he said quietly. "Come inside and get some coffee in you. Then you can tell me exactly what this Silas Blackwood did, and what you think I can do about it." Hope flickered in her eyes like the first spark of a fire that might just catch. She climbed to her feet on unsteady legs, swaying slightly as exhaustion and relief warred in her tired body. As Zeke led her toward his cabin, he tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered warnings about roads once traveled and bridges already burned. He'd spent 15 years learning to live with the ghosts of his past. But looking at Temperance Vale in her torn wedding dress, he realized that some ghosts demanded more than just peaceful coexistence. Sometimes they demanded action. Inside the cabin, Temperance Vale sat wrapped in one of Zeke's heavy wool blankets, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that steamed in the lamplight. The torn wedding dress lay draped over a chair by the fire, and she wore one of his clean shirts that hung on her like a tent. Despite the warmth, she couldn't seem to stop shaking. "Tell me about your father's land," Zeke said, settling into the chair across from her. In the gentle light, He could see the bruises on her wrists where someone had gripped her too tightly, the scratch marks on her neck from branches during her wild flight through the forest. Papa worked that spread for 23 years, Temperance began, her voice steadier now but still fragile as spring ice. Started with nothing but a team of oxen and a dream of something better than the life he'd left behind in Ohio. He built it up acre by acre, season by season, until he had near 800 acres of the best grazing land in the valley. She paused to sip the coffee, gathering strength from its warmth. When the fever took him last month, I thought the worst of my troubles would be working the ranch alone. Papa had taught me everything, how to read the weather, how to doctor sick cattle, how to keep the books. I figured I could manage until I found a good man to marry, someone who'd love the land like Papa did. What changed? Zeke asked, though he suspected he already knew. Silas Blackwood changed. The name came out like poison. 3 days after we buried Papa, he showed up at my door with papers. Said Papa owed him money, a lot of money. Said there was a contract that gave him claim to the land if the debt wasn't paid within 30 days of Papa's death. Zeke frowned. Your father never mentioned this debt? Never. Papa was careful with money, always said a man's word was only as good as his ability to back it up with coin. He would have told me about something like that. Her voice grew stronger as anger began to replace fear. But Blackwood had documents with Papa's signature, witnessed by the bank president and the territorial judge. Everything looked legal and proper, but it wasn't. Couldn't have been. Papa would have died before he put my future at risk like that. She set down the coffee cup with shaking hands. But when I tried to contest it, the judge said the documents were valid. The sheriff said there was nothing he could do. Even our lawyer, a man Papa trusted for years, suddenly decided he was too busy to take my case. The picture was becoming clearer, and Zeke didn't like what he saw. So Blackwood offered you an alternative. Marriage. The word came out flat and bitter. He said if I became his wife, the debt would be forgiven, and I could keep my home. Said he was being generous, that most men would just take the land and leave me with nothing. What kind of man is this Blackwood? Temperance was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. The kind who beats his horses until they're too broken to run. The kind who smiles when he causes pain. Papa always said there were 2 types of men in the world, those who use their strength to protect and those who use it to take. Silas Blackwood is the second kind. Zeke felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest. He'd known men like Blackwood during the war, men who saw weakness as invitation and kindness as opportunity. They were the ones who made the difficult choices easy, because any world without them in it was automatically better. Tell me about today, he said. About the wedding. It wasn't a wedding. Temperance's voice turned hard. It was a claiming. He had the preacher waiting at his house, along with half the town council as witnesses. Said we'd do it quick and legal, no fuss, no ceremony. Just get it done and move on. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I tried to say no when the time came. Tried to tell the preacher I wasn't consenting. But Blackwood had men positioned around the room, and everyone was looking at the floor like they couldn't hear me speaking. How did you get away? I didn't think I could. After the ceremony, Blackwood sent everyone away except his men. Said it was time for me to learn my place as his wife. The bruises on her wrists told Zeke more than her words did. He had me locked in an upstairs room while he drank with his friends below, celebrating his new acquisition. But you found a way out. There was a big oak tree outside the window. I used to climb it as a girl when Papa brought me to town. The branches hadn't moved much in 10 years. She managed a small, bitter smile. Blackwood probably figured a scared girl in a wedding dress wouldn't have the sense to shimmy down a tree in the dark. He figured wrong. I knew if I went home to the ranch, he'd find me before morning. If I went to the sheriff, he'd just bring me back. The only place I could think to go was up here, to find the mountain man Papa used to talk about. He said you'd been a soldier once, that you might understand what it means to fight for something that matters. Zeke was quiet for a long moment, weighing the girl's words against 15 years of careful neutrality. Getting involved in a land dispute meant taking sides. Taking sides meant making enemies. Making enemies meant the kind of trouble that followed a man wherever he tried to hide. But looking at Temperance Vale in her torn wedding dress, he realized that some troubles were worth facing. "Miss Vale," he said finally, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" "Come back to town with me. Help me prove that Blackwood's papers are fraudulent. Help me get my land back and my life back." She met his eyes across the small cabin. "Help me show the people of Mercy Hill that they don't have to live in fear of men like Silas Blackwood." It was the last part that decided him. Not the land dispute, or even the girl's obvious suffering, but the idea of a whole town held hostage by one man's greed and cruelty. He'd seen too many places where good people stayed silent while evil men prospered. Too many communities that withered under the weight of their own cowardice. "All right," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of saying no to the world's problems. "I'll come down to Mercy Hill with you, but I want you to understand something, Miss Vale. If this Blackwood is as connected as you say, proving fraud won't be as simple as showing up with the truth. Men like him don't give up their prizes easily. I know." Her voice was steady now, strengthened by the first hope she'd felt in weeks. "But Papa always said the truth has a way of making itself known if you're brave enough to speak it out loud." Zeke stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it he withdrew a gun belt he hadn't worn in 15 years, the leather still supple despite the years of storage. The cold peacemaker that hung in its holster had been cleaned and oiled regularly, maintained more from habit than expectation of use. "We'll leave at first light," he said, buckling the gun belt around his waist. The familiar weight of it felt both strange and comforting, like putting on clothes that had once fit perfectly but now carried memories of a different man. "Mr. Thorne," Temperance said, as he prepared a place for her to sleep by the fire. "Thank you. I know this isn't your fight." Zeke looked at her one more time, this girl who'd lost everything and still found the courage to keep fighting for what was right. "Miss Vale," he said quietly, "sometimes a man finds out that no fight is worth avoiding if it means watching good people suffer for his peace of mind." Outside, the wind picked up through the pines, carrying the scent of change from the valleys below. In the morning, Zeke would leave his sanctuary for the first time in 15 years. He would trade the simple honesty of mountain solitude for the complex demands of human justice. He tried not to think about what that decision might cost them both. The descent from Zeke's mountain sanctuary took most of the morning, following game trails that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows still wet with dew. Temperance rode behind him on his old mare, her arms wrapped around his waist as they navigated the steep switchbacks that led down into the valley. As they rode, she told him more about her father's life and the ranch that had been stolen from her. William Vale had been a man of simple faith and hard work, the kind who measured his worth in honest sweat and kept his word even when it cost him. The picture she painted was of a community that had once thrived under the protection of such men, before fear and greed had taken root. "Papa used to say that Mercy Hill was named for good reason," Temperance said as they paused to rest the horses near a creek. "When the first settlers came through, they found shelter there during a terrible blizzard. The townspeople took them in, shared what little they had, asked for nothing in return. Papa said that spirit of mercy was what built the town. What changed it?" Zeke asked, though he suspected he knew. "Men like Blackwood. They come into a place and make it about taking instead of giving, about fear instead of trust." Her voice carried a sadness that seemed too old for her years. "One by one, they break down the things that make a community strong. They buy the law, intimidate the honest folks, reward the ones willing to look the other way." By the time they reached the outskirts of Mercy Hill, the sun was high overhead and the heat was building toward an uncomfortable afternoon. The town sprawled along both sides of a muddy main street with the usual collection of businesses that served ranchers and travelers. A general store, a saloon, a hotel that had seen better days. But something felt wrong about the place, as if the very air carried a weight of unspoken tensions. People on the street noticed their arrival immediately. A few recognized Temperance and quickly looked away, their faces showing the kind of guilty discomfort that came from watching injustice and doing nothing to stop it. Others stared openly at Zeke, taking in his size and the careful way he carried himself, marking him as the kind of stranger who might mean trouble for someone. "Where can we find an honest man in this town?" Zeke asked as they tied their horses outside the general store. "Dr. Morrison," Temperance answered without hesitation. "He delivered me when I was born, set my broken arm when I was 12. He spoke up during the wedding ceremony, tried to stop it. Blackwood's men escorted him out before he could say much. But he tried. They found Dr. Morrison in his office above the barber shop, a neat space that smelled of carbolic acid and leather-bound medical books. The man himself was in his 60s, with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by much of anything. When Temperance walked through his door, his face showed relief, followed quickly by concern. "Temperance, child, what are you doing here? Blackwood's been turning the town upside down looking for you. He's got men posted on every road." Dr. Morrison stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Zeke filling the doorway behind her. "Dr. Morrison, this is Ezekiel Thorne. He's here to help me get my land back." The older man studied Zeke with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life reading people for signs of health and character. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded and gestured them toward chairs. "I was hoping you'd run far from here, girl. Put as much distance as possible between yourself and that devil." "I can't run from what's mine," Temperance said firmly. "Papa built that ranch with his own hands. I won't let Blackwood steal it just because he's got the law in his pocket." "The law." Dr. Morrison's voice carried a lifetime of disappointment. "Sheriff Morton used to be a decent man, believe it or not. But Blackwood owns his gambling debts, and a man in debt is a man without choices." "What about the documents Blackwood used to claim the land?" Zeke asked. "Have you seen them?" "I have, and they look real enough. Papa Vale's signature, proper witnesses, all the legal language a territorial court would want to see." The doctor moved to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey, pouring small glasses for all three of them. "But I'll tell you something that might interest you. 2 weeks before William died, he came to see me. Not for medicine, for advice." Temperance leaned forward. "What kind of advice?" He'd been going through his papers, getting his affairs in order like a man does when he feels his time coming. He found some documents in his desk that worried him, papers with his signature that he couldn't remember signing. Said it felt like someone had been in his house, going through his things. Zeke felt something click into place. Someone practicing his signature. That's what William thought. He asked me to witness a new will, one that specifically stated his land was to pass to Temperance free and clear of any debts or encumbrances. We did it right here in this office, with my clerk as second witness. Where's that will now? Temperance asked, hope rising in her voice. That's the question, isn't it? William took it home to put with his other important papers. When I went through his things after the funeral, at your request, Temperance, it was nowhere to be found. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, considering the implications. If Blackwood had stolen the legitimate will and replaced it with fraudulent debt documents, it was a crime that went far beyond simple land grabbing. It was theft, forgery, and conspiracy, all wrapped together. There's something else, Dr. Morrison continued. William wasn't the first property owner to die under suspicious circumstances right before Blackwood acquired their land. In the past 2 years, 3 other ranchers have passed away suddenly, and all of them had their properties claimed by Blackwood for various debts and legal complications. Are you saying he killed them? Temperance whispered. I'm saying I'm a doctor, and I know the difference between natural death and other kinds. But proving it would require an investigation that no one in authority seems interested in conducting. Zeke stood and moved to the window, looking down at the street below. He could see 3 men lounging outside the saloon, their eyes scanning the area with the practiced attention of hired watchers. Another man sat on the hotel porch, whittling and pretending not to notice everyone who passed. Blackwood's got the town under surveillance, he observed. He does. No one moves through Mercy Hill without him knowing about it within the hour. Dr. Morrison joined him at the window. Those men aren't locals. He brought them in from somewhere else, professionals who know their business. What about the people who live here? Are any of them willing to stand up to him? Some would, if they thought they had a chance. But Blackwood's made examples of the ones who tried to oppose him. Samuel Wright questioned the tax assessments. His barn burned down 2 days later. Mary Henderson complained to the territorial government about corruption. Someone poisoned her well. Temperance rose from her chair, her face set with determination. So we make them believe they have a chance. We show them that Blackwood can be beaten. Dr. Morrison looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. Child, I admire your courage, but you're talking about taking on a man who owns the law and has enough hired guns to outfit a small army. Then we'd better make sure we're smarter than we are strong, Zeke said, turning back from the window. His mind was already working through possibilities, calculating advantages and disadvantages the way he once had when planning military campaigns. Dr. Morrison, he continued, I'm going to need you to do something that might put you at risk. Are you willing? The older man straightened his shoulders. Mr. Thorne, I took an oath to do no harm. Letting Blackwood continue his reign of terror would violate that oath every day. What do you need? I need you to gather every honest person in this town who's willing to listen, Zeke said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. People who've been hurt by Blackwood, people who remember what Mercy Hill used to be like. But do it quietly, and do it carefully, Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. That can be arranged. Where do you want to meet? Not in town. Too many eyes and ears. Zeke considered their options. Is there a place outside Mercy Hill where people could gather without being noticed? The old Miller place, Temperance suggested. It's about 3 miles north of town. Been abandoned since the family moved to California last year. There's a barn where we could meet after dark. Good. Dr. Morrison, can you get word to people without Blackwood's men noticing? I make house calls all over the valley. People are used to seeing me come and go at all hours. The doctor was already reaching for his medical bag. How many people are you thinking? Start small. Maybe a dozen to begin with. People you trust completely. If this works, word will spread on its own. As Dr. Morrison prepared to leave, Temperance moved to the window and watched the street below. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the normal bustle of a frontier town seemed muted, as if people were afraid to make too much noise. Mr. Thorne, she said without turning around, can I ask you something? Of course. Back in your cabin when you decided to help me, what changed your mind? You could have pointed me toward the territorial capital and wished me luck. Zeke was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated, rooted in memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget, and responsibilities he'd thought he'd laid down forever. During the war, he said finally, I had a company of good men under my command, farm boys mostly, clerks and shopkeepers who'd never hurt anyone in their lives. They followed me because they believed I could keep them alive long enough to see home again. He moved to stand beside her at the window, his eyes distant with remembering. There was a town in Tennessee not much different from this one. Confederate irregulars had taken it over, were using it as a base to raid Union supply lines. My orders were to retake the town and secure the area. What happened? We did what we were told. Drove out the irregulars, restored Union control. But the townspeople, they'd been living under those raiders for months. Watched them take what they wanted, hurt who they pleased, make examples of anyone who resisted. When we liberated the town, do you know what the people did? Temperance shook her head. Nothing. They watched us fight and die in their streets, and when it was over, they went back to their houses and waited to see who would be giving orders next. They'd forgotten how to stand up for themselves. The bitterness in his voice surprised them both. I lost 12 men taking that town, Miss Vale. 12 good men who died believing they were fighting for people who wanted to be free. But freedom isn't something you can give to people who aren't willing to fight for it themselves. Is that why you left the army? Part of it. After the war ended, I kept thinking about those people who'd let themselves become victims, who'd traded their dignity for the promise of safety. I swore I'd never again fight other people's battles for them. Temperance turned to face him, her autumn eyes steady and serious. But you're here now. I'm here because you didn't wait for someone else to save you. You climbed down that tree and ran through the wilderness in a torn wedding dress because you weren't willing to accept what Blackwood tried to make you accept. He met her gaze directly. That takes the kind of courage that deserves support. A commotion in the street below interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Morton was walking down the main thoroughfare with two of Blackwood's men, stopping to talk to storekeepers and other townsfolk. Even from their vantage point, they could see the fear in people's postures as they answered whatever questions were being asked. "They're looking for us," Temperance observed. "Expected as much. The question is whether anyone will admit to seeing us." They watched as the search party approached the barber shop below Dr. Morrison's office. The barber, a thin, nervous man named Jenkins, spoke briefly with the sheriff, shaking his head and gesturing vaguely toward the road out of town. "Jenkins is all right," Temperance said. His daughter was one of the families that got driven out when Blackwood decided he wanted their water rights. The sheriff seemed satisfied with Jenkins' response and moved on. But one of Blackwood's men lingered, studying the barber shop with suspicious eyes. After a long moment, he followed the others down the street. "We can't stay here much longer," Zeke said. "Word will get back to Blackwood that we're in town. Where can we go?" "He's got men watching all the roads," Zeke smiled grimly. "Miss Vale, there's more than one way to travel through this country. Your father didn't build his ranch on a main road, did he?" "No, it's up a valley about 5 miles east of town. There are cattle trails that connect to the main road, but—" Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You want to go to the ranch. I want to search your father's house. If Dr. Morrison is right about Blackwood stealing documents and planting forgeries, there might be evidence we can use. And if we're going to rally people to fight back, they need to see that you're not running scared. Blackwood's probably got men watching the place. Probably. But they'll be watching the obvious approaches, not expecting someone to come in through the back country." Zeke moved away from the window and checked his revolver, ensuring the cylinder turned smoothly and the ammunition was secure. "Can you find your way to the ranch in the dark, using the cattle trails?" "I could find it blindfolded. Papa and I rode those trails 1,000 times." "Good. We'll wait for Dr. Morrison to get back, then head out after sunset. By the time Blackwood figures out where we've gone, we'll have what we need." When Dr. Morrison returned an hour later, his face showed cautious optimism. "I've spoken to 8 families, and they're all willing to meet tonight. There's anger in this town, Mr. Thorne, but it's been buried under fear for so long that people had almost forgotten it was there." "What kind of people are we talking about?" "Ranchers mostly, small business owners, a few of the more established families. People who remember what Mercy Hill was like before Blackwood started buying everything that wasn't nailed down." Dr. Morrison set his medical bag on the desk and sat heavily in his chair. "But I have to warn you, these aren't gunfighters. They're ordinary folks who just want to live their lives in peace. Sometimes ordinary folks can do extraordinary things when they're pushed far enough," Zeke replied. "The question is whether they're ready to be pushed back." "There's something else you should know," Dr. Morrison continued. "I heard some troubling news while I was making my rounds. Blackwood's expecting a visit from some territorial officials next week, judges and tax assessors, who are supposed to review property transfers and legal disputes. That could work in our favor if we can present evidence of fraud. It could, but word is these officials are already in Blackwood's pocket. The whole thing might be just for show, to make his land grabs look legitimate to anyone who might question them later." Temperance clenched her fists. "So he's not just stealing from individuals, he's corrupting the whole territorial system. A man with enough money and influence can buy a lot of legitimacy," Zeke observed. "But corruption cuts both ways. If these officials are taking bribes, they're vulnerable to exposure. That gives us leverage." As the sun began to set outside Dr. Morrison's window, Zeke felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders again. It had been 15 years since he'd planned an operation with stakes this high. But the skills were still there, buried under layers of chosen solitude, but not forgotten. Dr. Morrison, I want you to go to that meeting tonight and tell those people that change is coming to Mercy Hill. Tell them that sometimes the only choice is between fighting for what's right and watching everything you care about get taken away. He turned to Temperance, seeing the determination in her eyes that reminded him why he'd agreed to help her in the first place. Miss Vale, it's time to go home. The ride to the Vale Ranch took them through country that seemed untouched by the corruption-poisoning Mercy Hill. They followed cattle trails that wound between rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, staying well away from the main roads where Blackwood's watchers might spot them. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate safely while casting everything in silver and shadow. Temperance rode with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and creek in the territory, guiding them along paths that would have been invisible to anyone else. As they traveled, she pointed out landmarks from her childhood, the lightning-struck oak where she'd once found a family of orphaned fox kits, the meadow where her father had taught her to rope cattle, the ridge where they'd watched for the first signs of spring each year. Papa always said this land had a way of healing people, she said softly as they paused to rest the horses near a small creek. Said it could take a man all twisted up inside and straighten him out, given enough time and quiet. Zeke understood what she meant. The vastness of the country had a way of putting human troubles in perspective, reminding a person that most of the things that seemed so important were just temporary storms passing over something much larger and more enduring. Is that what it did for you? Temperance asked. Up in those mountains? For a while. He dismounted and let his horse drink from the creek, the water running dark and clear over smooth stones. But healing and hiding aren't the same thing. I spent 15 years learning the difference. They were within a mile of the ranch when Temperance suddenly raised her hand, signaling him to stop. She sat perfectly still in the saddle, her head tilted slightly as she listened to sounds only she could hear. Someone's up there, she whispered. At the house. Zeke drew his revolver and dismounted quietly, motioning for her to do the same. They tied their horses to a stand of cottonwoods and moved forward on foot, using the natural contours of the land to stay hidden as they approached the ranch buildings. The Vale homestead sat in a shallow valley surrounded by gentle hills, protected from the worst of the winter winds, but open enough to catch the morning sun. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch that spoke of evenings spent watching the sunset. Outbuildings were arranged in a practical pattern: barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and corrals that could hold a substantial herd. But tonight, the peaceful scene was marred by the presence of two armed men who sat on the front porch, their rifles across their knees as they kept watch over the approaches to the house. Blackwood's men, Temperance confirmed quietly. That's Jake Morrison, no relation to the doctor, and the other one's called Carson. Both of them are the kind who'll shoot first and ask questions later. Zeke studied the layout carefully, noting sight lines and potential approaches. The two guards were positioned to watch the main trail and the direct approach from town, but they weren't expecting anyone to come in from the back country. Their attention was focused outward, toward the roads, not inward toward the house itself. Is there another way into the house? He asked. Root cellar in back has an entrance that connects to the kitchen. Papa built it that way in case of Indian troubles back in the early days. Can you get us there without being seen? Temperance nodded, her face set with determination. Follow me and stay low. They circled wide around the homestead, using the barn and outbuildings to mask their approach. The night was alive with the usual sounds of the prairie, owl calls, the distant yipping of coyotes, the whisper of wind through grass. But Zeke's trained ear picked up something else, the low murmur of conversation from the front porch, punctuated by the occasional clink of a bottle against glass. They're drinking, he observed quietly. Good. Drunk. Men make poor guards. The root cellar entrance was hidden among a cluster of fruit trees behind the house, covered by a wooden door set almost flush with the ground. Temperance produced a key from a hiding place beneath a loose stone, and they descended into the earthen chamber that smelled of apples and preserved vegetables. A narrow stairway led up into the house proper, emerging through a concealed panel in the kitchen pantry. Temperance moved through her childhood home with practiced stealth, leading Zeke through rooms that still held the warmth of family life despite their recent tragedy. "Papa's study is upstairs," she whispered, as they crept through the main hallway. That's where he kept all his important papers. But when they reached the study, they found it in chaos. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents scattered across the floor. Books had been pulled from shelves, their pages rifled through and discarded. The safe in the corner stood open and empty, its lock apparently blown with black powder. "They've been through everything," Temperance said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Zeke knelt and examined the scattered papers, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. Most were routine business documents, bills of sale for cattle, correspondence with buyers in Denver and Chicago, records of feed purchases and equipment repairs. The kind of paperwork that accumulated in any successful ranching operation. But as he sorted through the mess, one item caught his attention: a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with William Vale's careful handwriting. It had been tossed aside with the other papers, apparently considered unimportant by whoever had searched the room. "What's that?" Temperance asked, moving to look over his shoulder. Zeke opened the journal and began reading by the light of a shaded lantern. The entries were dated over the past 6 months, chronicling William Vale's growing suspicions about his business dealings and the people around him. "Your father was keeping track of things that worried him," Zeke said, pointing to a particular entry. "Look at this. Found papers in my desk again today, moved from where I left them. Someone's been in the house while I was out on the range. Need to be more careful about locking important documents away." Temperance read over his shoulder, her breathing quick with excitement. "And here, Silas Blackwood asked too many questions about the North Pasture water rights today. Claims he's just being neighborly, but there was something in his eyes I didn't like. Need to check the boundaries again. Make sure all my markers are still in place." They continued reading, finding entry after entry that painted a picture of a man who had sensed danger closing in around him. William Vale had documented strange visitors, missing papers, and business offers that seemed too good to be true. In his final entries, made just days before his death, his suspicions had crystallized into certainty. "Someone's been practicing my signature," Zeke read aloud. "Found practice sheets in the fireplace that didn't burn completely. The handwriting looks like mine, but I know I never wrote those words. Going to see Dr. Morrison tomorrow to make a new will, one that can't be tampered with or replaced." "Papa knew," Temperance whispered. "He knew Blackwood was planning to steal everything." The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted their discovery. One of the guards was walking around the house, making a patrol circuit that would bring him past the kitchen window within minutes. Zeke closed the journal and tucked it inside his shirt. "We've got what we came for. Time to go." They retraced their steps through the house and down into the root cellar, but as they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching horses made them freeze. Through the cellar's small ventilation grates, they could see torches moving through the darkness. "More men coming," Zeke observed grimly. "Someone must have told Blackwood we were asking questions in town." "There's another way out," Temperance said, moving toward the back of the cellar. "Papa built a tunnel that connects to the old mine shaft up the hill. It was part of his contingency plan, in case of trouble. The tunnel was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for a man of Zeke's size to navigate. But it led them safely away from the house, as more of Blackwood's men arrived to reinforce the guards. By the time they emerged from the mine shaft a quarter-mile away, they could see at least a dozen torches surrounding the homestead. "He's taking this seriously now," Zeke said, as they retrieved their horses and prepared to leave the area. "Good," Temperance replied, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. "Let him know we're not going to run and hide. Let him know we're coming for what's ours." As they rode away into the night, carrying William Vale's journal and the evidence it contained, Zeke reflected on the change he could see in the young woman beside him. The frightened girl who had stumbled into his camp in a torn wedding dress was becoming someone else, someone who wouldn't be intimidated or broken by men like Silas Blackwood. The question now was whether they could turn that individual courage into something larger, something that could rally a whole community to stand up against the corruption that had taken root in their midst. By dawn, they would know if the people of Mercy Hill were ready to fight for their town, or if fear had already won the battle for their souls. The abandoned Miller barn stood like a dark sentinel against the star-filled sky, its weathered walls offering shelter to the small group of people who had gathered in response to Dr. Morrison's quiet summons. As Zeke and Temperance approached, on foot, leading their horses to avoid the sound of hoofbeats, they could see lamplight filtering through gaps in the barn siding. Inside, they found 11 people arranged in a rough circle on hay bales and wooden crates, their faces showing the mix of hope and apprehension that came with taking the first steps toward open resistance. Dr. Morrison had chosen well. These were the solid citizens of Mercy Hill, people whose families had built the community and watched it slowly succumb to Blackwood's influence. There was Samuel Wright, the blacksmith whose barn had burned after he'd questioned the tax assessments. Mary Henderson sat beside him, the widow whose well had been poisoned when she complained to territorial authorities. Tom Bradley, who ran the general store, had lost half his customer base when Blackwood had encouraged a boycott of businesses that didn't support his political ambitions. Other faces reflected similar stories of quiet persecution and growing desperation. These weren't troublemakers or radicals, they were ordinary people who had watched their community transform from a place of mutual support into something ruled by fear and greed. "Folks," Dr. Morrison said as Zeke and Temperance entered the circle, "I want you to meet Ezekiel Thorne, the man I told you about. And I think you all know Miss Vale." The reception was mixed. Several people rose to greet Temperance with obvious affection and sympathy, but others remained seated, their expressions cautious as they studied Zeke. A big man with the weathered hands of a rancher spoke first. "Name's Bill Crenshaw," he said, not offering his hand. "I knew your father, Miss Vale, and I'm sorry for your troubles. But bringing in an outsider, that might just make things worse for all of us." "Worse how?" Temperance asked, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there a week ago. "Blackwood's got this valley sewn up tight. Judges, sheriff, half the territorial government in his pocket. You think one man with a gun is going to change that?" Zeke stepped forward, his presence filling the space without seeming threatening. "Mr. Crenshaw, I'm not here to fight your battles for you. I'm here because Miss Vale asked for help, and because what's happening in Mercy Hill is spreading to other communities across the territory." "What do you mean?" Mary Henderson asked. "Blackwood's not just stealing land here. He's perfecting a system that can be used anywhere there's weak law enforcement and corrupt officials. If it works in Mercy Hill, it'll work in a dozen other towns." Zeke moved to the center of the circle, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "The question isn't whether you can afford to fight back. It's whether you can afford not to." He produced William Vale's journal from inside his shirt, holding it up so everyone could see. This belonged to Temperance's father. It documents months of evidence that Blackwood was planning to forge documents and steal the Vale ranch. It also suggests he's done the same thing to other families in the area. A murmur ran through the group as people leaned forward to get a better look at the journal. Tom Bradley cleared his throat nervously. "Even if that's true, what can we do about it? We're storekeepers and ranchers, not gunfighters." "You don't need to be gunfighters," Zeke replied. "You need to be citizens, citizens who demand honest law enforcement, fair courts, and legitimate business practices." Samuel Wright laughed bitterly. "Demand from who? Sheriff Morton takes his orders from Blackwood. Judge Patterson owes him money. The territorial representatives who are coming next week are already bought and paid for. Then we make sure they hear testimony they can't ignore," Temperance said, standing beside Zeke with the journal in her hands. "We document every crime, every instance of corruption, every family that's been driven out or terrorized. We present so much evidence that even crooked officials will have to take action. And if they don't? Bill Crenshaw asked. Then we make sure the evidence reaches people who will act on it, Zeke answered. Territorial governors can be replaced, federal marshals can be called in, corrupt judges can be impeached if there's enough pressure from honest citizens. Dr. Morrison stood and moved to a wooden box in the corner of the barn. From it, he withdrew a small stack of papers. I've been keeping records too, he said. Deaths that seemed suspicious, injuries that looked like the result of beatings rather than accidents, families who left town suddenly after mysterious financial troubles. Mary Henderson nodded slowly. My neighbor told me about cattle found dead on his range, poisoned for no reason except that he refused to sell to Blackwood at below-market prices. The Carter family, Tom Bradley added. Their oldest boy disappeared one night after he got into a fight with one of Blackwood's men. Never seen again. One by one, the people in the barn began sharing their stories, accounts of intimidation, theft, and violence that painted a picture of systematic oppression. As they spoke, Zeke could see something changing in their faces. The act of speaking their experiences aloud, of having them witnessed and validated by others, was transforming individual fear into collective anger. We need more than stories, he said when the testimonies had run their course. We need proof that will hold up in any court, before any judge. Documents, witnesses, physical evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. How do we get that kind of proof? Samuel Wright asked. We investigate. Carefully, quietly, but thoroughly. Zeke began outlining his plan. Blackwood's operation is too big to keep completely secret. He's got to have records, correspondence with his contacts in territorial government, financial documents that show where his money comes from and where it goes. You're talking about breaking into his office, Mary Henderson said. I'm talking about gathering evidence of crimes that have already been committed. Sometimes the law needs help finding the truth. Bill Crenshaw shook his head. You're asking us to risk everything. Our homes, our families, our livelihoods. What happens if this goes wrong? What happens if you do nothing? Temperance asked, her voice carrying the weight of recent loss. How many more families have to be driven out? How many more people have to disappear? How long before there's nobody left in Mercy Hill except Blackwood and the people who work for him? The barn fell silent as people considered her words. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote answered with a lonesome howl. Finally, Dr. Morrison spoke. I've lived in this community for 37 years. I've delivered most of your children, tended your sick, buried your dead. I've watched Mercy Hill grow from a handful of families into a real town with schools and churches and hope for the future. He paused, looking around the circle. I won't watch it die without a fight. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Samuel Wright was the last to commit, but when he finally spoke, his voice was firm. All right, we do this, but we do it smart. And we do it together. Nobody acts alone, nobody takes unnecessary risks. Agreed, Zeke said. We'll divide into small groups, each with specific tasks. Some of you will focus on gathering testimony from families who've been victimized. Others will work on documenting financial irregularities and property transfers. Dr. Morrison and I will handle the more dangerous aspects of the investigation. As they made their plans, Temperance felt something her father's mother's wedding ring seemed to symbolize, the possibility of a future worth fighting for. She touched the simple gold band that hung on a chain around her neck, remembering the love that had created it and the hope it represented. By the time they left the Miller barn in small groups, spaced apart to avoid suspicion, the first light of dawn was touching the eastern horizon. They had committed themselves to a course of action that would either restore Mercy Hill to the community it had once been, or destroy what little remained of it. But for the first time since her father's death, Temperance Vale felt like she wasn't fighting alone. 3 days of careful investigation had yielded more evidence than Zeke had dared hope for. Working in small, coordinated groups, the citizens of Mercy Hill had documented a pattern of corruption that stretched far beyond simple land theft. Tom Bradley had discovered discrepancies in tax records that suggested Blackwood was skimming money from territorial revenues. Mary Henderson had tracked down 2 families who'd fled the area and were willing to testify about threats and intimidation. Dr. Morrison had compiled medical evidence that supported claims of systematic violence against anyone who opposed Blackwood's interests, but it was Samuel Wright who made the discovery that changed everything. The blacksmith had been watching Blackwood's compound from a concealed position in the hills above town, noting the comings and goings of his men and the patterns of their activities. What he saw on the 3rd night made him summon Zeke and Temperance to an emergency meeting at his burned-out barn. "There's someone you need to see," Samuel said, his face grim in the lamplight. "Someone who rode into Blackwood's place tonight. Someone who might change how we think about this whole situation." He led them to a position that offered a clear view of the main house where Blackwood conducted his business. Through a pair of field glasses, they could see men moving around the property, but one figure caught Zeke's attention immediately. The man was tall and lean, with a way of carrying himself that spoke of military training and hard experience. Something about his posture, the set of his shoulders, was achingly familiar. "Let me see those glasses," Zeke said, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't name. When the figure turned toward their vantage point, Zeke felt the world shift beneath him like a landslide. The face in the field glasses was older, marked by years of hard living and harder choices, but it was unmistakably the face he'd seen in his nightmares for 15 years. "Marcus," he whispered. "You know him?" Temperance asked, alarmed by the change in Zeke's expression. "He's my brother." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Zeke handed the field glasses back to Samuel with hands that trembled slightly, his mind racing through implications and possibilities he didn't want to consider. Marcus Thorne, his younger brother by 3 years, the boy who'd followed him into the Union Army with stars in his eyes and unshakable faith in the righteousness of their cause. The last time Zeke had seen him, Marcus was lying in a field hospital with a Confederate bullet in his chest, his breathing shallow and his skin gray with approaching death. "But he died in the war," Temperance said, reading the confusion in Zeke's face. "You told me you were the only family you had left. I thought he was dead." "The field surgeon said he wouldn't last the night." Zeke's voice was hollow with shock. "I held his hand until he stopped breathing. I buried him myself in a little cemetery outside Nashville. Then who's that man down there?" Zeke studied the figure through the field glasses again, noting details he'd missed in his initial shock. Marcus, if it was really Marcus, bore scars that hadn't been there during the war. His left arm hung slightly stiff, as if an old injury had never healed properly. His face carried lines of weariness and something else, the kind of hardness that came from years of making choices no decent man should have to make. "I don't know," Zeke admitted. "But I'm going to find out." "Zeke, no." Temperance grabbed his arm as he started to rise. "If that's really your brother, and he's working for Blackwood, this could be a trap. They could know you're here, could be using him to draw you out, or he could be a prisoner, forced to work for them against his will." "Look at him," Samuel Wright said, taking another look through the field glasses. "That's not a man under duress. That's a man giving orders to other men." The blacksmith was right. As they watched, Marcus moved among Blackwood's men with obvious authority, directing their activities and receiving reports with the confidence of someone in a position of command. Whatever his relationship to Blackwood's organization, it wasn't as a reluctant participant. "We need to approach this carefully," Temperance said. "If your brother is really working for Blackwood, he could know everything about our investigation. He could be the reason Blackwood's men showed up at my ranch so quickly." Zeke felt something cold settle in his stomach. The possibility that Marcus, his little brother, the boy he'd tried so hard to protect during the war, might be actively working against them was almost too painful to consider. "There's only one way to find out for sure." he said finally. "I need to talk to him face to face." "That's exactly what they'd expect you to do," Samuel warned. "Walk right into their hands because you can't believe your own brother would betray you. Then what do you suggest?" "We stick to the plan," Temperance said firmly. "We gather evidence, build our case, and present it to those territorial officials when they arrive. If your brother is innocent, he'll be cleared when the truth comes out. If he's not—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If Marcus Thorne was working for Blackwood, he would face whatever justice the evidence demanded. Regardless of his relationship to Zeke, they were about to leave their vantage point when movement near the main house caught their attention. A group of riders had arrived, their horses lathered with sweat as if they'd been traveling hard. The leader dismounted and strode toward the house with obvious urgency, and in the lamplight spilling from the windows, they could see his face clearly. "Judge Patterson," Samuel Wright muttered. "What's he doing here at this hour?" The answer came 20 minutes later, when Marcus emerged from the house and began organizing a large group of armed men. Even from their distant position, they could see the purposeful way the men checked their weapons and mounted their horses. "They're coming for us," Temperance breathed. "Someone must have talked. Or they finally figured out we were the ones asking questions in town," Zeke replied grimly. He was already calculating routes and escape options, his military training taking over from the personal shock of seeing his brother alive. "Where can we warn the others?" Samuel asked. "Dr. Morrison first," Temperance said. "If they're rounding up everyone who was at that meeting, he'll be high on their list." They made their way quickly but carefully back toward town, using creek beds and fence lines to stay hidden from the search parties that were already spreading out across the valley. But as they approached Dr. Morrison's office, they could see it was too late. Torches surrounded the building, and armed men were escorting the doctor toward a waiting wagon. "They've got him," Samuel whispered, from their hiding place behind the blacksmith shop. They watched as similar scenes played out across Mercy Hill. Tom Bradley was dragged from his store. Mary Henderson was pulled from her home, despite her protests and struggles. One by one, the people who had dared to stand against Blackwood were being collected like cattle for slaughter. "How did they know?" Temperance asked, her voice tight with anguish. "How did they know exactly who was at that meeting?" Zeke studied the coordinated efficiency of the roundup, noting the way the search parties moved directly to specific locations without wasting time on random searches. This wasn't the work of men following vague suspicions. This was the result of precise intelligence. "Someone told them," he said quietly. "Someone who was at the meeting gave them names and locations." The betrayal hit harder than physical blows. These people had trusted each other with their lives, had risked everything to stand together against corruption and violence. To discover that one of their own had sold them out was almost too devastating to comprehend. "Who?" Temperance whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" Before Zeke could answer, they heard boots on the ground behind them. They turned to find themselves facing 3 armed men, their rifles trained and ready to fire. "Easy now," one of the men said, his voice carrying a mixture of authority and regret. "No need for anyone to get hurt." In the torchlight, Zeke could see the man's face clearly. It was Bill Crenshaw, the rancher who'd been the last to commit to their cause, the one who'd asked the most questions about the risks they were taking. "Bill." Temperance's voice carried disbelief and pain in equal measure. "I'm sorry, Miss Vale," Crenshaw said, but his rifle never wavered. "I truly am. But a man's got to think about his family, his future." Blackwood made it clear what would happen to anyone who opposed him, and what rewards were available to those who cooperated. "You sold us out," Samuel Wright said, his voice flat with contempt. "I made a practical choice. The kind your friend here should have made when he decided to stick his nose into business that didn't concern him." Crenshaw's eyes fixed on Zeke. "Blackwood's been expecting you. Mr. Thorne, he's got someone real eager to see you again." As they were marched toward the center of town, where the other captured conspirators waited under heavy guard, Zeke's mind raced through the implications of what he'd learned. His brother was alive, working for the enemy, and apparently knew he was in Mercy Hill. The resistance they'd tried to build had been betrayed from within. The people who'd trusted them were now prisoners because of choices he'd made. For the first time since he'd agreed to help Temperance Vale, Ezekiel Thorne wondered if his 15 years of mountain solitude had been wisdom rather than cowardice. Some battles, it seemed, were lost before they were even fought. The jail cell in Mercy Hill had been built to hold Saturday night drunks and the occasional cattle rustler, not a coordinated group of citizens who dared to challenge the established order. Zeke, Temperance, and 6 other members of their resistance movement found themselves crowded into a space meant for half their number. While armed guards kept watch outside the barred windows, Dr. Morrison sat on the single wooden bench, his medical bag confiscated and his gentle hands showing bruises from the rough treatment he'd received during his arrest. Samuel Wright paced the small space like a caged wolf, his anger at Bill Crenshaw's betrayal radiating from him in waves. Mary Henderson and Tom Bradley huddled together near the back wall, their faces showing the kind of defeat that came from having hope crushed just when victory had seemed possible. "We should have seen it coming," Samuel muttered for the 10th time. Crenshaw asking all those questions about risks, wanting to know exactly who was involved and what evidence we had. He was gathering intelligence from the start. "Hindsight's a luxury we can't afford," Zeke replied quietly. He was studying the construction of their cell, noting the age of the bars and the way they were set into the stone wall. During his years in the mountains, he'd learned to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. "What does it matter now?" Tom Bradley asked, his voice hollow with despair. "Blackwood's got us all, and those territorial officials will be here in 2 days to rubber stamp whatever fake evidence he's prepared. By the time anyone realizes what really happened here, we'll be scattered to the winds or worse." "It matters because we're not dead yet," Temperance said firmly. "As long as we're breathing, we can still fight." Through the barred window, they could see activity in the street outside. Blackwood's men were moving through town with the confidence of conquerors, collecting documents from businesses and homes, making it clear to anyone who might have been considering resistance that the time for such thoughts had passed. "Miss Vale's right," Dr. Morrison said, rising stiffly from the bench. "They wouldn't be holding us here if they didn't need us for something. Dead martyrs can inspire others to take up their cause. Living prisoners can be made to serve as examples of the futility of resistance. Or they're keeping us alive because someone wants to see us before we die," Zeke observed. His thoughts kept returning to the figure he'd seen through Samuel's field glasses, the impossibly familiar face that had turned his understanding of the situation upside down. They didn't have long to wait for an answer. As the sun was setting outside their cell window, footsteps approached down the corridor that led to the jail. Sheriff Morton appeared first, his tarnished badge catching the lamplight as he unlocked their cell door. Behind him came 2 of Blackwood's men, their rifles held ready but not quite aimed. "Zeke Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice carrying embarrassment as well as authority. "You're wanted for questioning." Zeke rose slowly, noting the positions of the guards and the distance to the door. But before he could consider any desperate action, another figure appeared in the corridor, and all thoughts of escape vanished from his mind. Marcus Thorne looked exactly as he had through the field glasses, older, scarred, marked by years of hard choices. But up close, Zeke could see something else in his brother's eyes, a pain that went deeper than physical injury, the kind of spiritual weariness that came from compromising one's principles so often that the original shape of one's soul was no longer recognizable. "Hello, Zeke," Marcus said quietly. "It's been a long time." The reunion took place in Sheriff Morton's office, with the 2 brothers sitting across from each other at a scarred wooden desk, while armed guards watched from the corners. For a long moment neither man spoke, each studying the changes that 15 years had wrought in the other. "I buried you," Zeke said finally. "I stood over your grave and said words I thought you'd never hear." "You buried someone," Marcus replied, "but it wasn't me. The field surgeon was wrong. I lasted through the night and into the next week. When I was strong enough to travel, I was transferred to a prisoner exchange program. Spent the rest of the war in a Confederate hospital, then a prison camp. Why didn't you find me? Why didn't you let me know you were alive?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the office walls. Because the man who survived that prison camp wasn't the same boy who followed his big brother into the army. The war changed me, Zeke, in ways that couldn't be undone with time or distance or good intentions. What do you mean? I mean, I learned things about myself I wish I hadn't. I learned that when you're hungry enough, cold enough, desperate enough, there's no limit to what a man will do to survive. I learned that principles are luxuries for people who aren't facing death every day. The bitterness in Marcus's voice was like acid on old wounds. Zeke had imagined this reunion countless times over the years, but never like this, with his brother wearing the colors of the enemy and speaking like a man who'd lost faith in everything that had once mattered to him. "So, you became an outlaw. I became a realist. After the war ended, there wasn't much call for men with my particular skills in legitimate enterprises. But there was always work for someone willing to do what others wouldn't. Ask the questions others were afraid to ask. Solve the problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. You mean killing and stealing and terrorizing innocent people?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I mean surviving in a world that doesn't care about the difference between right and wrong, only about who's strong enough to take what they want and keep it. That's not the world Papa raised us to believe in. Papa's been dead for 20 years. Zeke, his world died with him." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried years of accumulated pain. "Do you know what I learned in that prison camp? I learned that honor gets you killed, that mercy is weakness, that the only law that matters is the one enforced by men with guns. And that's the law you serve now. Blackwood's law. I serve my own interests, same as every man who's honest about it. Blackwood pays well, doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about my past, and gives me work that suits my talents." Marcus stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "He also offered me something I thought I'd never have again." "What's that?" "A chance to see my brother one more time before one of us dies." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. "Is that a threat?" Marcus turned back to face him, and for a moment, Zeke could see past the hardened exterior to the frightened boy who'd once followed him through Tennessee forests, believing his older brother could protect him from anything the world might throw at them. "It's a warning," Marcus said quietly. "Blackwood knows who you are, knows what you were during the war. He's been expecting someone like you to show up eventually, some do-gooder with military training who thought he could organize the locals and cause trouble. How long have you been working for him?" 3 years. Long enough to see how he operates, how he thinks. Marcus returned to his chair, leaning forward with the intensity of a man trying to explain something vital. "He's not just some small-town tyrant, Zeke. He's part of something bigger, connected to people in the territorial government, maybe even Washington. The money he's using to buy judges and officials, that's not coming from local cattle ranches. Where is it coming from? Railroad money, mining interests, land speculation companies? There are people back east who see the frontier as one big opportunity to get rich. And they don't much care what happens to the folks who are already living here." Zeke absorbed this information, realizing that their small-town resistance effort had stumbled into something much larger than they'd imagined. "And you're helping them." "I'm helping myself. But I'm also trying to help you if you're smart enough to listen." Marcus reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's a train leaving Helena tomorrow morning, bound for Denver. I can get you and the girl on that train with enough money to start over somewhere else. What about the others? Dr. Morrison, Samuel Wright, the people who trusted me to help them. They made their choice. Now they'll face the consequences. The way you did, by compromising everything you once believed in." Marcus's face hardened again. "By surviving when nobler men died. By learning that sometimes the best you can do is save who you can and let the rest go." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Zeke could see the logic in it, the cold practicality of cutting losses and living to fight another day. But he could also see Temperance's face, trusting and determined. And Dr. Morrison's gentle hands working to heal people who couldn't afford to pay. And Samuel Wright's angry integrity in the face of corruption. "I can't do that," he said finally. "You mean you won't?" "I mean I can't. Not anymore." Zeke met his brother's eyes directly. 15 years ago, I might have taken that train. 15 years ago, I was tired enough of fighting other people's battles that running away seemed like wisdom. But I learned something up in those mountains, Marcus. I learned that running away doesn't end anything. It just moves the pain somewhere else. And fighting doesn't end anything either. It just gets more people killed, maybe. But at least they die standing up. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. "You always were the stubborn one. Even as a kid, you'd rather take a beating than back down from what you thought was right. And you always were the smart one. Smart enough to see all the angles, to figure out how things really worked." Zeke leaned forward, putting every ounce of persuasion he could muster into his voice. "Help me, Marcus. Help me prove that some things are still worth fighting for." "Like what?" "Justice? Honor? The belief that good always triumphs over evil." Marcus shook his head. "Those are stories we tell children, Zeke. The real world is uglier than that. Maybe it is. But maybe it's only as ugly as we let it become." For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's eyes, a ghost of the boy he'd once been. The young man who'd enlisted in the Union Army because he believed in causes greater than himself. But then the moment passed, and the hard mask settled back over his features. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to think about my offer," he said, rising from his chair. "After that, you'll face whatever Blackwood has planned for you and your friends." "What does he have planned?" Marcus paused at the door. "A trial. Public, with all the legal formalities. Judge Patterson will preside, and there will be plenty of evidence presented. Forged documents, paid witnesses, testimony about your dangerous radical activities. The territorial officials will see justice being served according to law. And then you'll all be found guilty of conspiracy, sedition, and various other crimes against the territorial government. The sentences will be appropriately severe." After Marcus left, Zeke was returned to the cell where his companions waited anxiously for news. He told them about the offer of escape, about the larger forces at work behind Blackwood's operation, about the sham trial that awaited them. "So we have a choice," Temperance said when he finished. "Run away and live as fugitives, or stay and face certain death in a rigged courtroom. There's a third option," Zeke said quietly. His hand moved instinctively to his father's compass, the instrument that had guided him through war and peace, leading him finally to this moment when all his choices converged on a single point. "What's that?" Dr. Morrison asked. "We don't run, and we don't wait for them to hang us." Zeke looked around at the faces of the people who'd trusted him to lead them. "We fight. One last time with everything we have, for everything that matters. Against how many men?" Samuel Wright asked. "Against however many it takes. But we don't fight alone. We fight for everyone in this town who's been too scared to stand up. Everyone who's been waiting for someone else to make the first move." Outside their cell window, the lights of Mercy Hill twinkled in the darkness like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere out there, people were living in fear, accepting injustice as the price of survival, teaching their children that some battles couldn't be won. Tomorrow, Zeke thought as he settled against the cell wall to wait for dawn, they would learn whether that was true or not. Dawn came to Mercy Hill with the sound of hammering as Blackwood's men constructed a platform in the town square. From their cell window, the prisoners could see the structure taking shape, a raised stage where Judge Patterson would conduct his theatrical trial, complete with witness stands and seating for the territorial officials, who would validate whatever verdict Blackwood required. But Zeke's attention was focused elsewhere, on the subtle details that most people would miss. The guards posted around their jail were tired from a long night of vigilance, their attention wavering as the morning routine took hold. The construction noise masked other sounds, creating opportunities for movement that hadn't existed in the quiet darkness. Most importantly, he'd noticed something during his conversation with Marcus the night before. the way his brother had positioned himself near the window, the slight emphasis he'd placed on certain words, the meaningful glances toward specific locations. Marcus might be working for Blackwood, but he hadn't forgotten everything their father had taught them about family loyalty. "Dr. Morrison," Zeke whispered, drawing the older man close to the cell window. "When you were making your house calls yesterday, did you notice anything different about the Murphy place?" The doctor frowned, thinking back through his recent visits. The Murphy place. Old Sean Murphy moved to California 2 months ago. The house has been empty since then. Empty, but not watched. Blackwood's men are focused on the main roads and the occupied buildings, not the abandoned properties. Zeke turned to Temperance, who was watching the construction in the square with grim fascination. "How well do you know the building layout in this part of town?" "Well enough. Why?" "Because I think my brother left us a way out, if we're smart enough to take it," during his nighttime conversation with Marcus. Zeke had noticed his brother's eyes tracking toward the Murphy house, accompanied by subtle gestures that could have been meaningless, or could have been a coded message between two men who'd once communicated in battlefields where spoken words meant death. The plan that formed in Zeke's mind was desperate and dangerous, relying on precise timing and the kind of coordinated action that their small group had never attempted. But as the sound of hammering continued from the square, punctuated by Blackwood's voice directing the construction, Zeke realized that desperate times demanded desperate measures. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, gathering his companions into a tight circle. "When they come to move us to the trial, we're going to be ready." The opportunity came sooner than expected. Sheriff Morton appeared at their cell door before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, his face showing the strain of a man caught between his conscience and his survival instincts. "Time to go," he said, his keys jangling as he unlocked the cell. "Judge Patterson wants to get started early. Finish this business before the heat gets too bad." But as the prisoners filed out of their cell, Zeke noticed that only 2 guards accompanied the sheriff, fewer than there should have been for moving 7 potentially dangerous prisoners. Either Blackwood had grown overconfident, or someone had arranged for the regular complement of guards to be elsewhere. They were halfway across the square when Zeke made his move. A stumble that looked accidental brought him close enough to Sheriff Morton to grab the man's sidearm. In the same motion, he shoved Temperance toward the gap between 2 buildings, while Samuel Wright and Dr. Morrison scattered in different directions. "Run!" Zeke shouted, even as bullets began to fly around them. The next few minutes were chaos. Blackwood's men, caught off guard by the sudden escape attempt, fired wildly into the crowd of fleeing prisoners and innocent townspeople who'd come to watch the trial. Women screamed and men dove for cover as the peaceful morning erupted into violence. But in the confusion, Zeke glimpsed something that gave him hope. Several of the townspeople weren't running away from the gunfire. They were running toward it, armed with hunting rifles and farm tools, their faces set with the grim determination of people who'd finally reached their breaking point. Tom Bradley, the storekeeper whose business had been destroyed by Blackwood's boycotts, emerged from an alley with a shotgun in his hands and fire in his eyes. Mary Henderson, the widow whose well had been poisoned, appeared on a rooftop with her late husband's rifle. One by one, the citizens of Mercy Hill were revealing that their submission to Blackwood's tyranny had been a facade, maintained only until someone gave them a reason to hope again. The battle for Mercy Hill had begun not with a carefully planned assault, but with a desperate escape attempt that ignited the anger and frustration of an entire community. As Zeke fought his way through the chaos toward the Murphy house, where he hoped to find whatever aid Marcus had arranged, he realized that this was how all real revolutions began, not with grand speeches or elaborate strategies, but with ordinary people deciding they'd rather die free than live as slaves. Behind him, he could hear Silas Blackwood's voice rising above the gunfire, screaming orders to his men and promising terrible retribution for anyone who dared oppose him. The whip that had been the symbol of his power over the town cracked in the air as he tried to rally his forces. But the sound was answered by something else, the voices of free people fighting for their homes, their dignity, and their right to live without fear. The final confrontation was about to begin. The Murphy house provided exactly what Marcus had promised. A cache of weapons hidden in the root cellar, along with enough ammunition to arm a small company. As Zeke distributed rifles and pistols to the townspeople who joined their desperate rebellion, he felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. The burden of command he'd carried during the war and thought he'd laid down forever. "How many men does Blackwood have?" he asked Samuel Wright, who'd taken up position at a window overlooking the town square. "Maybe 20 gunmen, plus Sheriff Morton and his deputies. But half the town's turned against him now. I count at least 30 people with weapons, and more coming out of their houses every minute." Through the window, Zeke could see the battle taking shape. Blackwood's hired guns had taken defensive positions around his compound, using the buildings and wagons in the square as cover while they tried to establish fields of fire. But the townspeople knew every alley and rooftop, every hiding place and back entrance that could give them advantage over the professional gunmen. "Where's Blackwood himself?" Temperance asked, checking the loads in her father's old pistol. She'd found the weapon among the cache, along with a note from William Vale that brought tears to her eyes. A final message from a father who'd known his time was short but wanted to ensure his daughter could defend herself if the need arose. "Hold up in his office above the saloon," Dr. Morrison reported. "I can see him at the window, directing his men like a general commanding troops." And Judge Patterson? "Nowhere to be seen. Probably ran for the hills when the shooting started." The battle raged through the morning, as the two sides maneuvered for advantage through the streets and buildings of Mercy. Blackwood's men had superior firepower and training, but the townspeople had determination and intimate knowledge of their terrain. Every store and house became a fortress, every street corner a potential ambush point. It was Tom Bradley who broke the stalemate. The storekeeper had spent years watching Blackwood's men swagger through his establishment, taking what they wanted and leaving barely enough money to cover their debts. All that accumulated anger and humiliation found focus as he led a group of citizens in a flanking maneuver that caught 3 of Blackwood's gunmen in a crossfire. "They're breaking!" Samuel Wright shouted as the hired guns began falling back toward Blackwood's fortified compound. "Push them now before they can reorganize." But Zeke held up a restraining hand. "Wait, something's not right." He was studying the pattern of the retreat, noting how the gunmen were falling back in good order rather than fleeing in panic. This wasn't the collapse of a defeated force. It was a tactical withdrawal designed to draw attackers into a prepared killing ground. "It's a trap," he realized. "Blackwood's pulling us in close so he can finish us all at once." As if summoned by his words, Marcus Thorne appeared at the back door of the Murphy house, his face grim and his rifle ready. "You need to get out of here," he said without preamble. "Blackwood's got dynamite planted under the buildings around the square. He's planning to blow them all at once, take out anyone who's fighting against him, including his own men. He figures the ones who survive will be the ones worth keeping. The rest are expendable." Marcus moved to the window and studied the positions of the various combatants. "You've got maybe 10 minutes before he gives the signal. Why are you telling us this?" Temperance asked, her pistol trained on Marcus even as she listened to his warning. "Because my brother was right about some things being worth fighting for. And because I'm tired of being on the wrong side of those fights." Marcus turned to Zeke, his eyes carrying a mixture of regret and determination. "I can get you into Blackwood's compound through the back entrance. But once we're inside, there's no guarantee any of us come out alive. What about the people fighting in the streets? I'll signal Tom Bradley and the others, get them pulled back to safe distance. But someone has to stop Blackwood from setting off those charges, and it has to be someone who can get close enough to matter." The decision took less than a heartbeat. Zeke had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of choice. But now that it was upon him, the answer was clear. "Let's go." The route to Blackwood's compound took them through back alleys and abandoned buildings, using the confusion of battle to mask their approach. As they moved, Marcus shared intelligence he'd gathered during his years working for the corrupt land grabber, the layout of his offices, the location of his personal safe, the evidence that could bring down not just Blackwood, but his entire network of collaborators. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, as they prepared to enter the building where Blackwood waited. "The dynamite charges, they're wired to a single detonator in his office. If we can stop him from reaching it, we can save everyone. And if we can't, then we die knowing we tried to do the right thing." As they climbed the back stairs toward Blackwood's office, Zeke reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this moment. A frightened girl in a torn wedding dress had pulled him from his mountain sanctuary, leading him through a chain of events that would either restore justice to Mercy Hill or destroy it completely. Outside, the sounds of battle continued as the townspeople fought for their homes and their freedom. In a few minutes, one way or another, that battle would be decided. Zeke kicked open the door to Blackwood's office, his revolver ready, prepared to face whatever waited on the other side. The office was empty. Silas Blackwood's massive desk sat abandoned, papers scattered across its surface as if he'd left in haste. The window that overlooked the town square stood open, curtains fluttering in the morning breeze. But the man himself was nowhere to be seen. "He's gone," Marcus said, checking the corners and closets with the thoroughness of a professional hunter. "Must have slipped out when he saw how the battle was turning." Zeke moved to the desk, studying the scattered documents with growing understanding. Financial records, correspondence with territorial officials, detailed plans for acquiring property throughout the valley. It was all there. The entire corruption network laid bare in Blackwood's own handwriting, but his attention was drawn to something else. A wooden box sitting open on the windowsill, empty, except for a few scraps of wire. The detonator for the dynamite charges was gone. "He's got the trigger with him," Zeke realized. "He can still blow the charges from wherever he's hiding." "Not if we find him first," Temperance said from the doorway. She'd followed them up the stairs despite their protests, her father's pistol steady in her hands and determination burning in her autumn eyes. The search for Blackwood led them through the maze of buildings that surrounded the town square, following signs of hasty passage and the instincts Marcus had developed during his years as a tracker of men. They found him in the abandoned church at the edge of town, a building that had been closed since the preacher left, rather than serve a congregation living under the thumb of a tyrant. He was kneeling before the altar, but not in prayer. The wooden detonator box sat open beside him as he worked to complete the connections that would send destruction racing through the wires to the charges planted throughout Mercy Hill. "Stop right there," Zeke commanded, his revolver trained on Blackwood's broad back. The man who had terrorized an entire community for so long turned slowly, his face showing neither surprise nor fear. Instead, he looked almost relieved, as if the confrontation he'd been expecting had finally arrived. "Ezekiel Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the same authority it had always held. "I wondered when you'd work up the courage to face me directly." "It's over, Blackwood. Your men are beaten. The town's turned against you, and we've got enough evidence in your office to send you to prison for the rest of your life." "Evidence?" Blackwood laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "Evidence only matters if there's someone left alive to present it in court." His hand moved toward the detonator handle, but Marcus was faster. The younger Thorne brother had positioned himself at an angle that gave him a clear shot, and his rifle spoke with the authority of a man who'd learned to kill quickly and efficiently. Blackwood jerked backward from the impact, his hand falling away from the detonator as blood spread across his shirt. But he wasn't dead, not yet. With the tenacity that had made him dangerous, he lunged for the wooden box one final time. It was Temperance who stopped him. Her father's pistol cracked once, and Silas Blackwood collapsed beside the church altar, his hand just inches from the device that would have destroyed everything she cared about. For a moment, the three of them stood in the sudden silence, processing what they'd accomplished and what it had cost. Then Marcus moved to the detonator box, carefully disconnecting the wires that would have carried death to the innocent people fighting for their freedom in the streets below. "It's done," he said quietly. "The charges are safe." The aftermath of the battle for Mercy Hill played out over the following weeks like a slow-motion avalanche. Judge Patterson was found 3 counties away, his saddlebags full of gold coins and his mouth full of promises to testify against the corruption network in exchange for clemency. Sheriff Morton, faced with the choice between cooperation and prosecution, chose to reveal everything he knew about Blackwood's operation. The territorial officials who arrived to investigate found a community transformed. Where once there had been fear and submission, there was now determination and hope. Where once there had been isolation and suspicion, there was now cooperation and mutual support. Dr. Morrison resumed his practice with renewed purpose, treating the wounded from the battle and helping to heal the spiritual wounds that tyranny had inflicted on the community. Samuel Wright's new blacksmith shop became a gathering place for planning the town's reconstruction, both physical and moral. Tom Bradley's store expanded to serve the growing population of families who were returning to reclaim properties they'd been forced to abandon. Marcus Thorne faced his own reckoning with the law, but the testimony of the people he'd helped save carried weight with the territorial court. His sentence was commuted to time served, with the understanding that his future lay in making amends for his past through service to the community he'd helped liberate. And Ezekiel Thorne found himself transformed from hermit to hero, though he wore the role uncomfortably. The people of Mercy Hill wanted to make him sheriff or mayor or any other position of authority that would ensure his continued presence among them. But Zeke had learned something about himself during the battle for the town's soul. He was meant to be a protector, not a politician. Instead, he accepted a simpler role, as the husband of Temperance Vale and the guardian of the values that had made their victory possible. Their wedding took place in the same church where Blackwood had made his final stand. But the ceremony was everything her forced marriage had not been: joyful, voluntary, and blessed by a community that had learned the difference between law and justice. Temperance wore a simple dress of her own choosing, handmade by the women of the town as their gift to the bride who had refused to surrender her dignity or her dreams. As they stood before the new preacher, a young man with honest eyes and calloused hands who understood that faith meant standing up to evil, Zeke reflected on the journey that had brought him down from his mountain sanctuary. He'd learned that some fights were worth having, that some causes were worth the risk of everything, and that love could transform both the giver and the receiver in ways that solitude never could. The mountains would always be there, offering peace to those who needed healing. But Mercy Hill needed something else, the kind of hope that came from knowing someone was willing to stand between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. It was, Zeke realized as he kissed his new wife, while the bells rang out across the valley, exactly the kind of future worth fighting for.